Today we're lecturing on Plato. And as usual, we'll start off with the bio and then jump into the theories. Um, Plato's real name is Aristocles, allegedly. It's something that's a point of contention and debate amongst scholars. What is acknowledged by all of them is that Plato was just a nickname. In ancient Greek, Plato means, big round one, like a plate. That's where we get the word from. And he got that nickname because he had the build of a wrestler because he was a wrestler. In fact, he was pretty good at it in his younger days, in terms of Greco-Roman wrestling. He was the son of a wealthy aristocratic family. According to the family tradition, he was a descendant of Solon, which was the founder of Athens itself. Um, he was considered the prized pupil of Socrates. His two brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, were also students of Socrates as well. And one of the main things that we want to start off with is recognizing that um, Plato tried to restore the memory of his teacher Socrates from the negative reputation that he had gotten after the trial and execution. And he tried to restore the legacy of Socrates in two ways. One, he started writing dialogues. Um, Dialogues are like kind of like a play where it's got like a character's name and then it's a bunch of speeches, but it's not a play because it's not meant to be performed on a stage. And uh, Plato himself was the one who called them dialogues. Now, some people think that they're called dialogues because you see two or more characters having conversations, and that's true. But other scholars argue that he also called them dialogues because the idea was when you start reading his dialogues and you get introduced to these ideas of Socrates and Plato, it creates a dialogue in your mind as you begin to either like accept or reject some of these ideas and react with your own ideas. So they're called dialogues on two levels, right? The dialogue on the page that's happening between the characters, but also on a second level, the dialogue that's happening in your mind as you are reacting to the ideas that you're reading about. So he started writing these dialogues to try to kind of present Socrates' ideas in a way that would outlast both him and his teacher, and hoping people would, like, once they see these ideas presented on paper, they'd have more time to think about it and realize that Socrates was actually a good man and a great philosopher. The second thing he did to try to kind of restore the legacy of his teacher was creating the academy. Remember, Socrates was fairly well off, and he uses a big portion of his inheritance to and his property to create this academy. The academy was basically, what we would call in today's language a college, and it was in many ways the West's first major college. Um, and there he himself and other former students of Socrates, and then later other former students of himself, would become professors or teachers or philosophers who would teach classes and do lectures and engage in discussion with students who signed up for classes. And we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail in the next lecture when we talk about Aristotle, who is one of those students of the academy that studied under Plato. The next bullet kind of points out that um, Plato represents the first clear rationalist. A rationalist is someone who believes that reason is the primary source or the only source of gaining truth. So Plato is the first clear example of a rationalist. There were other rationalists, but before Plato, for example, Parmenides, who we discussed a couple of lectures ago. But Plato is the first one where we actually have significant number of his writings left behind Remember that for Parmenides, we only have a fragment of one poem remaining. Um, the other thing that Plato is, he's also an objectivist, like his teacher Socrates. Um, he believes there's only, the truth with a capital T that exists independent of human awareness. And for Plato, that truth is eternal and unchanging. Um, and we'll dig into that a little bit more as we move forward. Um, the dialogues that Plato wrote, he wrote many. Um, I think out of the ones that survived throughout history, we've got somewhere near 20 something of those dialogues to read through. Um, these dialogues are broken up into three periods. The early dialogues, like the Apology and the Credo that we talked about last lecture, those record what is considered the historical Socrates and the teachings of the historical Socrates. So, as we saw in the Apology and the Credo, we get to know Socrates and what he really thought in the early dialogues of Plato. Then, the second stage are the middle dialogues, like the book we'll be discussing today, which is called the Politeia. Um, in Greek, that's what Plato titled it, Politeia. Later, the Romans translated it into the Res Publica, and since then, now we call it the Republic of Plato. But originally, it's important to remember that he called it the Politeia, or the city. Um, and it still has Socrates as a character in these middle dialogues, but even though Socrates is a character, it's not really the historical Socrates anymore, in the sense that what comes out of the mouth of the character Socrates in the middle dialogues is often really Plato's own ideas, and you're going to kind of see that in a couple of minutes right now. Then there's the late dialogues. Examples of the late dialogues are one called the Theaetetus, and then another one called the Laws, which in some ways is a revision of the Republic. Um, these often don't have Socrates as the main character. Sometimes Socrates is not even present. And in these dialogues, the interest is primarily in debunking Plato's own theories from the middle period. So, like towards the end of his life, Plato was kind of reconsidering his ideas from the middle dialogues and realizing that a lot of times he was just kind of spinning ideas out there without really knowing how whether they were true or not. Right? He was just kind of um, theorizing without any real evidence. And so, in the end of his life, he starts writing new dialogues that are meant to kind of criticize his own ideas from earlier, to try to show that maybe we really shouldn't trust those ideas after all. And so that's kind of an interesting career trajectory for Plato in terms of his dialogues. So let's jump into what is perhaps the most famous of Plato's um, dialogues, the Republic, or Politeia. The book is concerned with one primary question. The question is, what is justice? And in book one, it's broken up into 10 books or 10 chapters. In book one, Socrates, the character, is kind of engaging in a conversation with several characters at dinner. The first one is an old man named Cephalus, who's actually the one paying for and hosting the dinner everybody's at. And old man Cephalus defines justice as paying one's debt. Um, as soon as Socrates begins to ask him some questions the way that he normally does, Cephalus uses his old age as an excuse. He says he's getting tired, it's past his bedtime, and he's off to bed. And he escapes Socrates' debate and instead gives the debate over to his son as part of his inheritance, right? And his son's name is Polemarchus. So Polemarchus is trying to defend the dad's idea of paying one's debts, and as a kind of way of defending that definition, he refines it and fixes it. He defines paying one's debts, which is justice, as benefiting one's friends and harming one's enemies. Again, Socrates begins to kind of ask a bunch of questions Polemarchus runs into some problems, and he begins to realize he doesn't really know what he's talking about. He was only coming up with this definition based off of, what he had learned from his father. And this brings up a good point that is found in an early dialogue that we did not discuss called the Euthyphro. In the Euthyphro, um, the guy debating Socrates, Euthyphro, is on his way to court where he's bringing up murder charges against his father for the death of a servant. And, what comes out in that dialogue is that Euthyphro is only doing this because that's the example his father set. And so both Euthyphro and chapter 1 of the Republic have this common thread of sons that are running into problems with Socrates because of ideas they inherited from their fathers. And so one of the things that Plato's kind of pointing out in both cases is to what extent many of us believe what we believe about the world around us just because we inherited those ideas from our parents. And what Plato's trying to make clear in both dialogues is that um, inheriting ideas from our parents is not good enough. It does not equal knowledge, and it does not necessarily guarantee virtue or excellence or eudaimonia, a good life. Um, the our parents often want us to do better than them, and so if they didn't go to college, they want us to go to college, and if they didn't make a lot of money, they want us to make a lot of money, and if they didn't get to go on vacations, they want us to go on vacations, and so on. But one of the things Plato's pointing out is that as much as parents want us to improve on ourselves, um, to have a better life than them, one thing they don't ever seem to want us to do is to have better knowledge than them. They don't ever seem to push us to have better ideas because they always want us to inherit their ideas. And what Plato's trying to point out is what parents wanting you to have a better life, but not necessarily to have better knowledge, is contradictory. Because since Plato is the student of Socrates, he agrees with Socrates' idea that you cannot have a better life without better knowledge, right? And so that's one of the things we see happening here with Cephalus and Polemarchus. These answers aren't good. Justice, cannot be just helping your friends and harming your enemies. One of the things Socrates points out is you can't call it justice to harm your enemies. Um, he gives a hypothetical. He tells Polemarchus, is it justice to harm an innocent man in court? And Polemarchus says, no, that's literally unjust, right? Trying to use the laws and the justice system to harm someone when they're innocent. And he says, well, what if that person is your enemy? You just said that justice is to harm one's enemies. So on the one hand, you're saying justice is harming your enemies, which includes an innocent man in court. But on the other hand, you're saying that it's unjust to harm an innocent man in court. So you're contradicting yourself. And this is where Polemarchus begins to realize that, his answer has problems. His idea of justice has problems. And so at this point, another guy that's at the dinner named Thrasymachus, the name should sound familiar. This is indeed the Thrasymachus that later in Socrates' real life ends up taking him to court and getting him arrested and executed. Thrasymachus jumps in, according to Plato, into the middle of the debate after being held back by Glaucon and Adeimantus, the brothers of Plato. He jumps in like a wild animal, it says in the book. No longer able to contain himself. And he accuses Socrates of playing games with words, which is ironic because that's what Socrates brought up in the Apology about the Sophists. And he says, I have a better definition than anything that you guys can come up with. And I challenge you, Socrates, to find a way to disprove this idea. And so Thrasymachus defines justice as what benefits the stronger. In other words, what he means is that those in power are the ones who define justice in the system that they're in power in. And they always define it in a way that benefits themselves. So, in other words, the people who are in charge of a democracy define justice in a democratic system in a way that keeps them in power. Kings under monarchy define justice in a way that keeps them kings. Dictators come up with laws that keep them as dictators, and so on. And so the point that Thrasymachus is making is that justice is nothing but a system or an idea created by people in power for keeping themselves in power. In other words, Thrasymachus is what we call a positivist, right? Might makes right. And interestingly enough, Plato's brother Glaucon supports Thrasymachus with this. And he jumps in and helps defend Thrasymachus from Socrates' attacks. And he even presents a new argument. He says, look, Socrates, teacher, um, people only pretend to honor justice in public. They only pretend to care about, you know, justice, honor, and good when everybody's watching because that's what's expected of them, right? But in secret, they really do value injustice and they would perform it if they think they can get away with it, right? And so, kind of, Glaucon is jumping in with Thrasymachus. You know, Thrasymachus is arguing that those in power define justice to benefit themselves, and then Thrasymachus is saying, and everybody underneath them, the people, are not any better, right? If they were in power, they would do the same thing. And so this ends up presenting a difficulty in trying to come up with a better idea of justice because, after all, Socrates, the character, and Plato, the writer, are objectivists, not positivists. They want to argue that there really is a truth called justice that we should be trying to understand and to create in the world around us. And this brings up a key point about why this book is still read 2,300 years later, and why the question about what is justice is important. This isn't just a debate for lawyers and judges. Um, this is the very foundation of society. Every society is based on some concept of justice, not only in terms of its court system or its prison system or its laws, right? But in terms of what creates the glue or the cohesion that keeps a society together, right? Uh, we all are after some form of justice, some form of equality, some form of freedom, right? These are different ways of defining justice, and we're all pursuing it. That's why we continue to exist in a society. And so this ends up being an important question. And Glaucon and Thrasymachus are bringing up actually very good points, much better than Cephalus and Polemarchus. Thrasymachus and Glaucon are bringing up the point that despite the fact that we talk about justice, in on TV or in conversation or in speeches in front of large crowds, or when it's election day and we go vote, the fact is we talk one way in public, but we act another way in private. And that includes the people in charge of us. They give us speeches that sound great and make promises, but then when they're in office, they act a very different way, a way that undermines and destroys those ideas they're talking about in speech. How do we wrestle with that? How do we deal with that? And so the point Plato's making is we cannot ever fix that until we know what justice is, right? How can we disagree with them and tell them their answer is wrong if we don't have a better answer to give them? And that's one of the things Thrasymachus was accusing Socrates of, right? He always takes the easy way by just tearing other people's answers down, but he never gives any answers of his own. And so this is Plato, the writer, kind of telling us, well, I'm going to try to give us an answer instead of just destroying it. Right at this point, when Glaucon and Thrasymachus are bringing up these points, they bring up this story called the Ring of Gyges, right? And you see a picture of the Ring of Gyges in a way. right here in this picture, right? According to the story, Gyges was a shepherd who worked for the king, and while he's out with the flock, out in the countryside, a huge earthquake opens up, and it exposes this golden horse statue underneath the earth, and Gyges, who you see here in blue, jumps down into the this kind of golden horse and looks inside, and he finds a kind of like a giant skeleton of of a formerly dead man who's wearing a ring with precious stones on it. And Gyges grabs the ring and climbs back out. And while he's hanging out with the other shepherds, he's kind of playing with the ring and looking at it. And he slips the ring on, and everything's fine when the jewels are kind of out in the sunlight. But when he turns the ring upside down so that the jewels are underneath in his hand, no longer in the sunlight while he's wearing it, he notices that it becomes invisible when the shepherds kind of get surprised that he's no longer there, and they start asking each other, what happened to Gyges? Where did he go? And so Gyges recognizes that it's a magic ring that makes him invisible. Now, this sounds familiar because some of you like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. It should be. J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, was a student of old languages, including ancient Greek. And so he knew Plato's story, and he took the idea of the ring of Gyges to create the ring of Sauron that you see in that story, right? That ring that makes you invisible. And just like that ring it corrupts the people who wear it, back in the story that Plato is telling us in the Republic, the same thing happens with Gyges. Gyges begins to use the ring of invisibility, and he begins to get corrupt. He starts off by killing the head shepherd so that he can step into the position and become the head shepherd himself. This brings him into the castle to report on how the flocks are doing to the king directly. Once he has access to the king, he's able to use the ring to sneak around and find a way to get to know the queen. He seduces the queen, starts to have an affair with the queen until he convinces her to plot with him. Together they murder the king. She chooses him as the new husband, thereby making him the next king. And so he rises up from shepherd to king because of the power of the invisibility of this ring. Now, why tell us a story at this point? Well, the basic idea of the ring of Gyges is that, right, invisibility, right, is a power that offers freedom from consequence, freedom from responsibility. And that power of invisibility to free you from consequence and responsibility leads to injustice. It leads to murder and adultery and corruption. And in many ways, what Plato's trying to kind of suggest is that this kind of echoes what Thrasymachus is telling us, right? The people in power are in power because their power is invisible, right? In many ways, we, the citizens, are not aware of the ways in which people have power over us, right? We're not aware of it, and this gives them greater power, and this allows them to be corrupt and to kind of manipulate situations to their own advantage. And so this is the challenge that Plato's facing in this book, right? How can we define justice as better than injustice when everything in the history book tells us that injustice rules the world, right? Kings, dictators, communists, capitalists, doesn't matter what system you look at, the people who are at the top tend to be corrupt. They tend to use power invisibly without consequence, and it serves them at the expense of the rest of us. So how can we convince young people that justice is better, right? And that's the problem of the text. That's what the Republic or the Politeia is trying to address. So Plato points out again, what exactly is justice? How do we find justice? How do we define it? And so uh, Plato points out that there are different parts of the soul in the individual, just like there are different parts of the polis or the city, right? Just like you have different members of a society, laborers, soldiers, philosophers, and kings, you have different parts inside of you, appetites, desires. There's many of those, right? Just like there's many different types of laborers. Um, Laborers, you have farmers, you have botanists, you have industrialists, you have clerks, you have craftspeople, you have business people. So the same way that you have all of these people that work to produce stuff in a society. Plato points out that inside your soul or your mind, there are many appetites: the appetite for food, the appetite for drink, the appetite for sex, the appetite for money, the appetite for power, the appetite for being accepted, the appetite for friendship, the appetite for love. Many different desires and appetites, usually in competition with each other. The same way that we have soldiers and military and law enforcement to enforce the law, there's something called spirit or courage, right? Or heart. Um, Basically, today it's what we would call will, right? It's willpower. There's something in you that pushes you to doing X or Y, right? And the same way we have philosophers and scientists and thinkers and theorists is the same way we have intellect, reason, the mind with knowledge. And so there's different parts within us, just like there's different parts of the state, right? We'll come back to this idea. This is just something he's setting up at the beginning, and he's going to go somewhere with it. But before that, he also brings up this idea of the cave, right? He gives us another story. The Republic actually has quite a few stories put in there that Plato either creates or that he kind of adapts from older stories. Um, in Plato's allegory of the cave, he describes how there are prisoners that have been raised within the cave their entire lives. And they're chained in such a way where they can only face the back wall. Behind them is another wall. And behind that wall is a fire that creates a light. And there are puppeteers that are using shadow puppets to cast these shadows on the wall that the prisoners look at. It's the only thing they've ever seen. All they ever see is the light of the fire and the shadows of the puppets. And as these prisoners grow up, it's the only world they know is the world of the shadows, and they take those shadows to be real, right? To them, the only world is the world of the shadows. And some of them become better at naming shadows, and the other prisoners begin to listen to these prisoners who are good at labeling shadows, right? They become the more important prisoners. Then, in the story, one of the prisoners, right, you see this one with the gray hair, right, is dragged out from the prison and slowly thrown out of the cave. And in the story, he's blinded at first. And the first thing he recognizes on the ground are shadows. And this reassures him because it's like the world that he knew before. But as his eyes begin to get used to being outside in the sunlight, his eyes move away from the shadows and they begin to recognize rocks and bushes and the ocean and birds and trees. And eventually he begins to look upwards and he begins to recognize clouds and finally the sun, right? And when he finally sees the sun, he finally it all clicks and he realizes that the world outside the cave that he's being exposed to is the real world. He begins to see horses and dogs, which he recognizes from their shape, but these are the real dogs and the real horses, not like the ones in the shadows that the puppeteers used to use in the cave. And so the prisoner, once he realizes this is the real world and his fellow prisoners are stuck in a fake world of shadows down in the cave, this guy comes back down into the cave to try to help rescue the prisoners to bring them out into the real world. But when he comes back from the world of sunlight to the world of darkness, his eyes need time to adjust. He bumps himself, he trips and he falls, and he has trouble orienting himself within the cave. When the prisoners are able to notice this, right, um, they think there's something wrong with him, right? They think this guy is kind of this, especially when they hear him talk, when he starts talking about blue and red and sky and ocean, and when he talks about this ball of burning gas up in the sky called the sun or a star, he he looks crazy. He sounds crazy to them. And when he tries to force them out of their chains to rescue them, to pull them up into the world, they get frightened, they get angry, and they grab him as soon as they can because he gets close enough, and they kill him with the chains. And that's the story of the allegory of the cave. Now, an allegory is a genre of story, which is always very short, where everything symbolizes something else, right? So the cave and the shadows represent something, the prisoners represent something, the puppeteers represent something, the fire represents something, the world outside represents something, and the sun represents something. And Plato explains it right after the story. Basically, the story of the cave, the allegory of the cave, in a nutshell, it's about us. We are the prisoners of the cave. And the shadows that we take for truth are our beliefs, our feelings, our opinions, right? We see, hear, smell, taste, and touch these things in our lives, and we begin to develop feelings and opinions about them. But it never occurs to us that these feelings, opinions, and beliefs are based off of subjective experiences, personal experiences that could have been different, right? Um, if think about the beliefs you inherited from your parents that we talked about with Polemarchus and Encephalus. You cling to those because those are what your parents taught you. But if you think about it, your ideas and beliefs would be completely dramatically different if you had been born to different parents. Are you telling me all parents are right? So what makes one set of parents more right than another? How can you ever know for sure if you're only going based off what your parents taught you, right? That's what makes us trapped in the cave. We're trapped in our own feelings. We're trapped in our own biases. We're trapped in our own prejudices that have been created primarily to our parents. Our parents are a big portion of why we're prisoners in a cave, right? The path out of the cave is the path of knowledge, the path of the philosopher, the path of trying to reach the good, the real good, the good that you gain through knowledge, not the good that you're just taught by somebody else. Now, given that most people in the world are like this is why we live in a mess. Society's a mess, right? And so for Plato, he believes that when it comes to politics, when it comes to society, when it comes to the polis, right, the city and the state, these problems that we have, like poverty, crime, corruption, these things are going to continue until we get somebody with knowledge to rule, right? Until we get somebody who actually knows what the good really is to rule over the rest of us, right? And so he starts to imagine an ideal state, a perfect society, right? Which is also connected to a perfect soul. Remember, the city has different parts, just like the soul has different parts, and so keep that in mind. What you see there in the chart is that in the perfect society Plato thinks of, there's the lower class or the common class, the warrior class, and the ruling class, right? The lower class are the farmers, the craftspeople, and just the normal everyday citizens. People who farm, people who make things like furniture and clothes, people who work in different places. They're the lower class. Now, I use lower class like this because in Plato's society, they're not poor. They're lower class in the sense that they do not have power. They're not going to be given control of the government, but you will go into that in a bit, right? Well, actually, let's just jump into it now, right? Here you see it, the commoners. So they get a basic education. They only learn how to read and write. They learn music. They learn PE. They learn combat skills, and they learn whatever their trade skill is, right? Whatever they need to have their job. So they learn how to make furniture out of wood, or they learn how to make saddles out of leather, or they learn how to make swords out of metal, right? And that's it. That's the only education they need. Is just how to do their job, how to read and write, how to play music, and then how to like fight in case they ever need them to fight to defend the city. That's the common people. They have no political power. They can never be kings. They can never make laws. They can never be in charge of juries. But in Plato's society, they can have families and they can own property. And if they're good at what they do, they can even be rich. But there are limits, right? After you get rich enough to be able to take care of your family while you're alive, that you get cut off and your extra money is given over to the state, so that then they can use it to keep people from being too poor, right? Notice Plato doesn't want people that are too rich or people that are too poor, because this creates problems within the state. It creates corruption and it creates crime. And so once people make enough money where they're taking care of their families in comfort, the extra money is taken from them through taxation and used to help those other people, not to take care of them like in welfare. Plato doesn't want that either, but in order like to take care of them while they are retrained in new skills, so that then they can become employed and earn their necessities, right? But the key thing is that the commoners are free to work and make property and have families. This is not the case for the people who have power. All right. So the second class are the warriors, soldiers and police. Um, Plato calls them auxiliaries and guardians because their job is to guard the state. They are basically what today we call the Army Corps of Engineers. They're also what we call law enforcement, and they're also what we call the military. In Plato's ideal society, he would let them get an education up to the engineer level. So they would learn how to use weapons, obviously, like the catapult. For that, to understand the catapult, just like to understand a cannon, you need to understand aerodynamics. You need to understand the basic level of physics. You have to be able to calculate trajectory and arc and incorporate wind velocity and mass in order to make your calculations so you can hit your level. This is what made Napoleon's military exceptional. He had the best engineers using cannons with precision, so they would level armies before they even engaged them. And so Plato recognizes the need for that. And so his auxiliaries, his military, they get an education up to the engineer level. Their primary job is to protect the state from enemies, both enemies on the outside, like foreign countries, but also enemies on the inside. And here we're not just talking about criminals. More importantly, we're talking about corruption, right? These are chosen amongst the best of men and women in the state. Yes, women are allowed to be in the military in Plato's ideal society. You got to remember, this is 300 years before Jesus Christ. So that's 2,300 years ago, and Plato's already recognizing the role for women in not only government, but in the military itself. However, no one amongst the military or the guardians are allowed to have families. And they are not allowed to own property. This is to prevent greed. This is to prevent corruption, right? And the same thing with the families. For Plato, once you have a family, you want to value your family over other families. Since their job is to take care of all families in the state, it's probably best if they don't have their own personal family. So the only family they really know are the other guardians, so that they basically fight and defend each other, kind of like in the way that the U.S. Marines fight and defend each other, right? They become family by the time they go through training, and by the time they go through their experiences. However, they do have all of their necessities taken care of. They have places to live together in communal barracks. They have their armor, they have their clothes, they have their food, they have their weapons, they have their supplies taken care of by taxes, right? So the common people have property and families, but they pay taxes, and those taxes take care of the guardians and the auxiliaries. Does that make sense? In the meantime, who's ruling, right? Who's making the decisions? That's another group of guardians called the philosopher kings. These are the ruling elite. They are the smartest, the most educated, the most humble, and the most unambitious. These are the ones that have proven time and time again they're not interested in power, they're not interested in wealth. In fact, these guys don't even want to be philosopher kings. They'd rather be in a lab or in a library or out in nature studying it. And that's how you know that's the one you want ruling, right? You want to give power to the one who doesn't want power, right? The last thing we should be doing is giving power to people who want more power than they already have. And so this is why, Plato believes societies will continue to be messed up until you have somebody like a philosopher for a king. These, in the ideal society of Plato, his utopia, they are taught all subjects. They study math and reading, engineering and science. They study, combat. They study art. They study music, psychology, philosophy, political history, political theory, etc. They study all subjects because they have to know about everything to make decisions that affect everybody. They end up having complete control of the state for the sake of maintaining the state, of protecting the state. So notice the guardian auxiliaries listen to the philosopher kings in order to enforce the laws, right? Again, guardians, philosopher kings do not have families, they do not have property, and everything they need they get through the taxes, just like the auxiliaries. The one difference is that whereas the auxiliaries live in the communal barracks, the philosopher kings do get kind of like their own private study where they can do library research and experiment. There's one other thing. No one in the society is allowed to lie except for the philosopher kings. They are allowed to create noble lies or myths. And what exactly is a noble lie or a myth? A noble lie or a myth is basically um, a story or a mythology that is created. It's not true, but it's created for the purposes of shaping the minds of children and adults to make them better men and women, right? In other words, the philosopher king is allowed to lie if it is a lie that is meant to make better people in the state. And so there's an example he creates. Here's story number 3, the myth of the metals, right? He tells this story about how the this perfect society was created when these people were given birth to inside the caves of the earth, right? That Mother Earth, the island underneath the island, gave birth to the citizens of this perfect society. And it made some of them out of gold, a few. It made some of them out of silver, and then it made most of them out of bronze, right? And obviously the ones out of bronze are the ones that are the commoners. The ones out of silver are the auxiliaries, and the ones made out of gold are the philosopher kings, right? And the idea of the story, like if you taught, like the idea was to teach this to little kids as soon as they're born, and keep teaching them this story until they grow up. The whole point of the story is to make them feel like every single citizen in the society are actually brothers and sisters, so that they take care of each other the way they do family and blood, and that they are all the children of the island, so that they are willing to defend the island to the death the way that most of us would defend our mothers, right? And so notice that like it's meant to unify them, and it's meant to get them to no longer care about hierarchy, right? They shouldn't care that the philosopher king is the king, because he's a brother who happens to be looking out for the rest of us like an older brother would. So notice, like, it's a lie, but it's meant to kind of create a stronger unity amongst the citizens of the state, right? And only a philosopher can figure out how to do that, according to Plato. Um, the guardians, both the philosopher kings as well as the auxiliaries, they are uh, allowed to have sex, but they're only allowed to reproduce, um, you know, once a year to a festival where there's a rigged lottery that chooses the genetically best ones to breed with each other to make the best possible guardians for the next generation. So notice there would be, let's say, like tablets with names inside a clay vase, right, or pot. They would stir it, and they would pull out names of like a male guardian and a female guardian, and then they would like go off to, a room in the barracks or a tent or whatever, and get it on with each other in order to get her pregnant with a baby that would become the next generation of guardians, right? But it's rigged, right? The idea is that the philosopher kings would be cheating so that only the best of the best amongst the guardians would be the ones getting more chances to reproduce with each other, and the ones that are or worse, they would be cheated out so that they would never be allowed to reproduce, so that we don't get that inferior quality of genetics in the next generation. If that sounds to you like eugenics, which is what certain governments have tried to do in terms of breeding out inferior genetic material, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Plato's already kind of talking about that in 300 BC, because he's using the example of livestock in ranches, right? Farmers do the same thing. Ranchers do the same thing. They get the best animals to reproduce more, and they try to get the worst animals, worse in terms of like breeding and stock and genetics, to reproduce less, so they don't keep passing it on, right? Once the babies are born, they would be raised together in kind of like an orphanage, right, by the guardians themselves. So the guardians would raise their own babies, but nobody would know whose babies was which. So they would raise all the babies together as if they were all their younger siblings, right? This kind of, again, the idea of one family fighting to the death to defend each other. Now remember that the common people represent the appetites in the soul, desires, right? The warriors represent the spirit or the will. And the philosopher kings represent the reason. And then here you see kind of like who gets what. So, that's Plato's perfect society, right? And what many consider the West's first utopia, right? A perfect society. For Plato, he calls it an aristocracy. Aristos means the best. Krasi means rule by, right? So aristocracy is when you're ruled by the best, right? The smartest people make the decisions. The toughest people defend everybody. He called this particular city Gallipolis, which means the beautiful city. All right. Now, Plato. This is all like a fictional city that he's creating there in the conversation that their characters are having. And he points out that even if we could build it for real in the real world, right, it wouldn't last forever, because nothing lasts forever. Anything that comes to be ceases to be. Anything that is created within time is eventually destroyed by time. And so, the aristocracy would eventually begin to like degenerate to a timocracy or military rule, which would then degenerate into a plutocracy, which is ruled by the wealthy, which then becomes a democracy, which means ruled by the mob of the many, which eventually becomes a tyranny, right? And you see that here in like the infographic here, how like the society keeps going from best to worst to worst to worst. Um, so why are they in this order? Well, in the aristocracy, you have people who are intelligent that don't care about power, making decisions for the benefit of all. Right? The aristocracy with the philosopher kings, and so it creates this kind of harmony, justice. People, you know, sure they don't have property and families, but they don't care about that. They care about the fact that they want the people taken care of, right? And so you have like the best people becoming carpenters and the best people becoming um, blacksmiths and the best people becoming soldiers and the best people becoming rulers, right? Whatever you're good at, that's what you become. That's why it makes it an aristocracy, and for Plato, that's the best society we can live in. The timocracy is this is when the military takes over, right? So eventually the auxiliaries would get tired of taking orders, and eventually they would take over. This is the second best for Plato because even though you no longer have the smartest person in charge, when you have a military in charge, they still keep order in the state. So there's no crime, really. Um, people are still pretty much free to continue pursuing their jobs, and they still have like property, and they still have like their families. So the democracy, the military rule for Plato is the second best one. It still has all of the things that you're looking for. It just doesn't have the smartest people in charge anymore. Um, the third one, a plutocracy. This is when the rich take over. The reason why this one is like the third best is because, um, yes, the people at the top are greedy and they're corrupt, but the society still only some people are corrupt. Most people are still good, and the ones that are corrupt are only corrupt by one thing, which is money, right? So therefore, they still have a lot of self-control. They can still control themselves and not give in to everything, right? And people who want money are going to want people to be in a good condition to work hard. So they're going to take care of those people enough to get them to work hard so that they can continue producing the wealth that these people have, that these people want, the elite. So there's still some good coming out of it, right? Notice for Plato, democracy is the second worst of the six. The reason? Everybody's free to pursue their appetites. Everybody's pulling society in their own direction, right? Women care about women. Uh, Minorities care about minorities. People in power care about power, etc. Right? Young people care only about the young. No one's willing to listen to the old. So, for Plato, the democracy is kind of like almost a chaos, with society kind of falling apart as the people all pull in their own direction. And his criticism of democracy is reflected in many ways in what's happening in America right now, right? One of our problems with democracy is no one cares about democracy, or no one cares about the U.S. Within the U.S., citizens care about themselves. Everybody, the rich pull in the direction of the rich, poor pull in the direction of the poor, middle class pulls in the direction of the middle class, Christians pull in the direction of the Christians, the LGBTQ pulls in the direction of LGBTQ, right? Black Lives Matter pulls in the direction of Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter pulls in the direction of Blue Lives Matter. There's no compromise. Everybody's out for themselves, and democracy suffers. And this is what Plato was afraid of. That's why he put democracy as second of the worst of societies that you can live under. So what's the last one? Tyranny. Why is tyranny the worst? Because violence and lies become the primary tool to keep everybody under control, right? He says force and fraud are the tyrant's tools, right? Um, and so, and it's not just the tyrant that's using lies and violence to rule over everybody. it becomes the go-to move for everybody else, right? In a tyranny, everybody's afraid of being turned over, of being betrayed, of being arrested, of disappearing in the night, of getting picked up by the death squads, right? Because that's how a dictatorship runs. That's how a totalitarianism runs. Everybody's spying on everybody else, and everybody's paranoid of everybody else. And that's what makes it the worst of all the societies. Now, one of the things that Plato points out is for every um, for every society, there's a soul, right? The aristocracy, which is the perfect society, philosophers, the smart ones, are in charge. For a person, that means the reason is in charge, right? A person ruled by reason becomes the philosopher, becomes the good person, becomes the person of virtue that Socrates was talking about. Option, best choice, choice number one. The second person is the person ruled by the will, the person who always has to be in control, right? Now, yes, we think of a controlling person as a negative thing, but for Plato, a person who's in control of themselves is a good thing, right? Third is the person who has only one appetite, the appetite for wealth, right? Fourth is the person who has many appetites, right? So they go from like hunger to thirst to lust to wrath to tiredness, right? And they're just kind of getting pulled in all directions. That would be the democratic person, right? The person whose liberty is defined by desire and appetite. And then the worst kind of person is the person who's lost, right? The person who's a complete mess, the addict, the person who's got all the appetites ruling over them and they have no self-control whatsoever, right? Um, by the end of this, we finally arrive at a definition of justice for Plato. For Plato, justice is the harmony of the state itself, right? Justice in the state can be achieved only if you have a harmony created by a state where you have every person who's good at something in charge of that thing, right? So you have the philosophers ruling, you have the auxiliaries enforcing, and you have the common people kind of doing their own jobs, right? Making stuff and building stuff, etc. And so, um, for 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 Plato, that's the only way you can achieve justice in the state is if you can create a perfect state where everybody's good at their job and everybody's good at doing their job, and nobody interferes with each other because you all trust each other to do what's right because you're all qualified for what you're doing. Right? That kind of harmony is justice. You see that in Houston sometimes in traffic. Um, for example, when all the construction going on in traffic, there's always a lane that's being closed for construction, and when people have to merge, you see people, between the two lines that are merging into one. They always come up with a, one car goes from one lane, then the other from the other lane, and it's a one and one. And when people do that, it creates this harmony, and the lines go as fast as possible. The only time we run into problems with these lines is when people become selfish, right? And two or three cars want to go from one lane, and they start honking at each other, and people get aggressive or whatever, right? So notice injustice versus justice, right? Justice is a harmony where people take care of each other and cooperate. That's justice in the state for Plato. What's justice in the soul? Basically, a just person, a just man, who is led by reason. Reason that's filled with knowledge and wisdom, that tells you what the truth is. For example, your desires should be kept under control. Right? And so that's kind of one of the main things that Plato kind of concludes with in the Republic. That justice is a harmony in the soul, led by reason, and a harmony in the state, led by philosophers. Right? Obviously, the criticism people can bring up is it's kind of convenient for Plato, who's a philosopher, to think that philosophers would do the best job ruling. everybody thinks they do the best job, really. Something to think about. All right, that kind of concludes today's lecture on Plato's Republic. By no means is this all of it. He's got so many ideas in that book. You could spend a lifetime studying it all. But these are some of the big ideas. I hope you got it. I hope you understood it. There's a lot of material in here that's kind of complicated. But if you don't get something, remember there's other lectures in there that we can use as well. All right, I'll see you in the next lecture, which will be on Aristotle.